Your speech was very inspiring and showing how efficient and in fact positive effect of public services in our economy and also for our health, for our life is. And I think that that is a first good introducer for this conference. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is not Walden Bello. He cannot make it. But we have a great replacement. Our former Dean Ofreneo, Rene Ofreneo, a professor of the University of the Philippines and former Dean of the UP School of Labor and Industrial Relations. And he was also Undersecretary of Labor years ago. He has written books on labor and labor rights in the Asia Pacific and on fair trade and on industrial policies. Ana wants me to say that he is co-convener of Dignidad and the president of the Integrated Rural Development Foundation. Comrade Rene.
Thank you. Good morning. Very good presentation. I am one of the foot soldiers of Tina Ebro. And David Hall gave a very good overview of public services and economic development. What I'll do is just supplement with some notes on the Philippines and Asia. And also, and highlight some of the challenges facing us. So, I was given 15 minutes, so I prepared 50 slides. Okay, please. Let me start with a quotation from a friend from Italy. The changing world we are in, the old world is dying, and the new one is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Next. These are really very confusing times, and that's why we are very happy to listen to David Hall, because he gave a very good overview of what's happening from the land of privatization. We have, if you are in the labor movement, especially in the ILO, they always talk about the future of work and these dramatic changes brought about by artificial intelligence, robotization, etc. And yet, and this, that has seized the imagination of many people here in Asia. And yet, so many are hungry, so many are unemployed, inequality is so deep. In every country, 1% of society owns 99%. Philippines is now affected by the crisis in the Middle East, and to me, I support some of the efforts of the president to bring home some of our migrants. They are very bad employers there, and of course, you have the rise of demagogues, and goodbye democracy, goodbye Fukuyama. Fukuyama, once upon a time, after the fall of Berlin Wall, said the end of history, proclaiming the golden age of neoliberalism. Next. And there are more confusions, of course. We know the surprises from Donald Trump, America First, and withdrawal from TPP. But what is very striking, and this is consistent with some of the slides of David Hall, in June 2016, the IMF Research Department wrote that neoliberalism is oversold, arguing that instead of delivering growth, some neoliberal policies have increased inequality, in turn jeopardizing durable expansion. Of course, they're talking about this management of the current account. And this they do after preaching neoliberalism for 4 decades, and once upon a time picking up a quarrel with Mahathir of Malaysia on capital controls. Next. So what is the situation in ASEAN and Asia today? The World Bank and ADB, every year, for the last 15 years, they have been warning about rising inequality across the region, country by country, especially China. In the Philippines, 40 families out of 105 million Filipinos control the economy. And about a dozen of them control this very big program called Build, 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 for public-private partnership on infrastructure development. And yet the solutions offered by the World Bank and ADB are more of the noodle bowl of free trade agreements. You see, ASEAN as a hub has given birth to over 100 bilateral regional free trade agreements, especially after the impasse in the WTO talks in Geneva. But big powers have their respective national global agendas. China talks of free trade, and yet it has a strong state guiding its market economy and pursuing an Asian global Silk Road. They have also a maritime Silk Road via the One Belt, One Road initiative. U.S. Trump adopts unilateralism, but it still maintains existing trade and economic relations in Asia. Japan trying to sustain the Trans-Pacific Partnership and try to balance China's BRI and role in ASEAN's. So you have this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or RCEP. Next. Nevertheless, and this one difficulty of activists in the region is neoliberal economics hardly mentioned these days. This kind of economics has lost its allure, but it remains the dominant framework. Neoliberal economists have stopped calling themselves neoliberal. Very few admit that they are neoliberal. But they're still pushing for neoliberal policies of trade, investment, various sectors. And they have even adopted the vocabulary of the civil society organization, like the language of people empowerment, inclusive growth, sustainable development, gender equality, etc. And neoliberals have been making strategic adjustments. Next. First, of course, in the 1980s and 1990s, it was so easy to analyze them because they have a straightforward uniform liberalization program. And of course, it became known worldwide as the Washington Consensus. But in the late 1990s, the old Washington Consensus became the new Washington Consensus. And here in Asia, especially after the Asian financial crisis, they started talking of moral hazards. It's a code term for corruption, as if this is the main cause of the crisis in the region. And then they're talking about business rules, human capital development, and institution. And then from 2000 onwards, another adjustment. These neoliberal reform advocates from IMF, they embrace social protection. Nobody is against social protection this day. And then they try to introduce in Indonesia, Philippines, and other Asian countries this experiment in Latin America called conditional cash transfer. Or in Brazil, you call it Bolsa de Familia. And then they're talking now of financial regulation, strengthening the reserve requirement of banks, etc. Next. So, but overall, and I think this supplements the discussion of David, neolibs are silent or passive on the issue of race to the bottom. This is well known among us. There's race to the bottom at the national, regional, and global level. It's the roots of deepening inequality among and within countries. Those globalization means those with global reach are able to operate globally across borderless economies. And they ride roughshod on labor, human, community rights, and even national standards. Race to the bottom is the roots of crisis of overproduction, high productivity in low-cost platforms or organized value chains, and under consumption because you have low purchasing power of workers and other small producers worldwide. It is at the roots of labor precarity, social exclusion, and environmental degradation almost everywhere. Next. And yes, privatization has become the pivotal policy in economic governance. Now, in the case of the Philippines, we have waves of privatization. We were one of the first guinea pigs of the World Bank IMF when it comes to structural adjustment, because before it became known as Washington Consensus. This was in 1979, 1980. And 1980s, you have the initial salvo was in the form of privatization of government-owned controlled corporations. And in the case of our agricultural sector, after giving so much money to the sector in the 1970s, all of a sudden they withdrew them assistance in the name of what they call as agricultural deregulation. And that started the crisis of agriculture, 1980s, 1990s, even up to the present. That's why agriculture now is less than 10% contribution to the GDP. In the 1990s, cash-starved government, from Cory to Ramos and so on, began privatizing public assets. And these are big military camps. So you have, where they set up this new buildings and so on, and then they started privatizing power and water. At the turn of the millennium, it has become all-out privatization of public services. One is through budget cut for certain services, and of course, the promotion of what we imported from UK, PPP, Public-Private Sector Partnership. And then from 2000, the present decades, you have now all-out privatization of infrastructure development and delivery of public services via PPP modality. There's no debate in Congress about this. There's no debate in the planning board. You need road, PPP. You need strengthen this MRT, PPP. You need a new hospital, PPP. It's always PPP. Next. And also, let me inform you that social protection has become a battlefield. And who should take the credit for leadership? You see, many in the civil society, we have been fighting for decades for social protection, universal, comprehensive, and so on. Then all of a sudden, here's the World Bank, and then the ADB, they're proclaiming they are for universal, comprehensive social protection. They are the leaders. And yet, before, during the heyday of neoliberalism, 1980s, 1990s, they don't want social protection. For any protection, the answer is always privatization. You buy your own insurance. But now they're talking about aid, and of course, it started with in Thailand with Thailand's health insurance after the Asia financial crisis. The ILO has become bolder, pushing for universal protection, and then in 2012, pushing for a recommendation on a national floor, and so it becomes problematic because both are talking of the same social protection. Next. But there are certain and unresolved issues on the delivery of social protection and public services. Government says yes to universal and comprehensive social protection, but raises the question of where do we get the money? And that's why you have this issue of taxation and the challenge of lobbying Congress all the time. And so we have some friends here who are very active on in the Freedom from Debt Coalition talking about this. Government says yes to social protection and public services, but proposes delivery through private sector providers. For example, you have universalization of education, but they're not building new public schools. They're simply allowing private schools to take over, and they're given training vouchers from the government. And then road construction undertaken by private builders who are given privilege to collect tolls. And so it's become adds on to the cost of transport. Government says yes to universal health care, but pushes for a system of universal insurance coverage, rather than a universal state-led healthcare system based on strong primary healthcare at the community level. So there's a big difference there. And government say yes to assistance to all the poor. Don't worry, you will be given conditional cash transfer. But in the process, they forget the role of urban reform, rural reform, and the primacy of job creation, which is really the key to restoring the dignity of a person and the key in combating poverty. In other words, conditional cash transfer to me is social tokenism. And it is not real liberation from poverty. Next. Meantime, Philippines has big ambition. We have Ambition 2040. Right now, the group of Professor Ed Tadem here is doing a study on, we are in the middle income trap from since 1975-76. How to get out of it. The ambition of the government is by 2040, we will be a developed country. People live long, healthy lives, smart, innovative, high-trust society where families thrive in vibrant, culturally diverse, and resilient communities. Next. But how do they achieve this? Now, the task is, according to our National Economic Planning Agency, triple the national income per capita in 25 years through robust and sustained growth. And there are two main roads for government. Use various policy instruments in investing in human capital, of course, infrastructure. I think this is hardly debatable. The second one, next. Wipe out poverty by creating conditions for growth of enterprises that generate high-quality jobs and produce high-quality goods and services at competitive prices. Give priority for enterprises with a market and able to participate in global trade. So last year, there have a manufacturing summit focusing on global value chain, courtesy of the USAID, organized by a certain neoliberal economist by the name of Ramon Clarete. But anyway, reiterated over and over, foreign investment liberalization, including charter chains, more domestic competitiveness via the regulation, PPP infra, for investment and participation in global value chain. These are classic neoliberal economic prescription.